The suitcase lying on Claire's bed felt like a foreign object, an intruder in a room that had been a closed ecosystem for 2 years. It was a matte black shell, cold and unyielding, serving as the only physical evidence that she was actually leaving. For 24 months, her world had been measured in the distance between her mahogany desk and her indigo-painted walls. Now, it was about to be measured in thousands of miles. Claire stood in the center of her room, slowly pivoting on her heels. She was saying goodbye to the corners, one by one. She looked at the spot on the rug where she had sat while recording her first viral script. She looked at the heavy velvet curtains that had acted as a silencer against the outside world. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out the silver fountain pen Edward had given her. She tucked it into the inner pocket of her coat, right over her heart. She wasn't packing many clothes. Her wardrobe was a collection of oversized sweaters and dark fabrics, but she was packing her entire history. At the front door, the morning air of Oak Ridge felt like a physical sting against her skin. Her face felt thin, exposed, and vulnerable, as if it had forgotten how to interact with the direct touch of the wind. Eleanor stood holding her shawl, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears that held a mixture of grief and pride. Edward stood beside her, his posture rigid like an ancient oak, though his hand trembled slightly as he gripped the brass handle of the door. "Remember, Claire," Eleanor whispered, adjusting the collar of her daughter's coat. "Los Angeles is a city built of artificial lights, but you carry the only true light inside you. Do not let them change the pitch of your voice." Claire leaned in, burying her face in her mother's shoulder, inhaling the scent of jasmine for the last time. The hug was long and heavy, a silent exchange of all the words they hadn't said during the dark years of her recovery. She was thanking them for not letting her drown when the water was at its highest. As Claire climbed into the black car sent to ferry her to the airport, the house on Elm Street began to shrink in the rearview mirror. A wave of mild agoraphobia hit her, a sudden, sickening realization that the world was wide. For 2 years, her boundaries were four walls. Now the boundary was the horizon. The sky looked terrifyingly vast and the streets felt like endless rivers of gray stone. She immediately pulled her large, noise-canceling headphones over her ears. They weren't playing music, they were her armor. It was a visual signal to the world: I am here physically, but my mind is a private property. Do not enter. Through the tinted windows, Claire watched the town slide by. She saw teenagers laughing on a street corner, a woman sprinting to catch a bus, a man reading a newspaper on a bench. She felt like an alien observing a different species. Do they know, she wondered, do they know that the ghost is passing them by? Do they realize the voice they listen to in the dead of night is sitting inside this car? The drive to the airport was the first real test of her composure. Every red light felt like a countdown, and every plane she saw ascending into the clouds made her feel like the next victim of the world's gravity. She was no longer just a writer in a room. She was a body in motion, and the momentum was taking her toward a life she had only ever seen in her dreams and her nightmares. The car pulled up to the terminal, and the sound of the world outside hit Claire like a physical wave. The airport was not just a building, it was a cathedral of transit, a cavernous hall of glass and steel, where thousands of lives intersected for a fleeting second before scattering to the corners of the earth. For someone who had mastered the art of being still, the sheer velocity of the airport was suffocating. As Claire stepped out of the car, the air changed. It no longer smelled of her mother's jasmine or her father's old books. It smelled of jet fuel, expensive perfume, burnt coffee, and the cold, metallic scent of air conditioning. The noise was a symphony of chaos, the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the departure boards, the frantic rolling of suitcase wheels on polished marble, and the disjointed announcements echoing in a dozen different languages. Claire adjusted her headphones, pulling them tighter against her skull. She felt like a diver submerging into a deep, turbulent ocean, hoping her oxygen would hold out. Walking through the automatic sliding doors felt like passing through a portal. Suddenly, she was no longer in Oak Ridge. She was in a no-man's land. To Claire, every person in the terminal was a potential threat. She saw the security guards with their unblinking eyes, the harried businessmen pushing past her without a glance, and the groups of tourists who seemed to take up too much space. She kept her head down, focused on the heels of the person in front of her. "Don't look up," she whispered to herself, the mantra drumming in her chest. "If you don't look at them, they can't see you. You are still the ghost. You are just a shadow moving through a hall of mirrors." The most terrifying part was the security checkpoint. For Claire, this was the ultimate exposure. She had to take off her oversized coat, her literal armor. She had to place her leather-bound journal, her soul, in a gray plastic bin to be scanned by X-rays. As she stood in the body scanner, her arms raised in a gesture of surrender, she felt a cold shiver of vulnerability. For those few seconds, she wasn't the powerful narrator with 500,000 followers. She was just a girl with trembling hands and a secret. She watched as her journal disappeared into the black mouth of the X-ray machine. She felt a phantom pain in her chest, as if they were scanning her internal organs, looking for the scars Mrs. Gable and Sarah had left behind. Once through, she found a corner seat at gate B12. She chose a chair that faced a wall, creating a tiny, makeshift fortress in the middle of the crowded terminal. She opened her laptop, the familiar glow of the screen acting as a digital hearth. She looked at her reflection in the glass window. Beyond her own pale face, she saw the massive wings of the Boeing 747 that would carry her to California. It looked like a prehistoric bird, indifferent to her fears. She began to type, not a script, but a raw observation of the moment. "The airport is a place where no one belongs," she wrote. "Everyone is in between who they were and who they are going to be. We are all ghosts here, suspended in a vacuum of schedules and last calls. I am sitting 3 feet away from a man crying into his phone and a woman laughing at a magazine. We are islands in a sea of linoleum, and for the first time my isolation doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like a survival instinct." "Now boarding Zone 1 for Flight 402 to Los Angeles," the voice crackled over the intercom. Claire's heart did a slow, heavy roll in her chest. This was it. There was no back door, no turning back to the house on Elm Street. She gripped the handle of her carry-on until her knuckles turned white. She stood up, her legs feeling like they were made of water. She took a deep breath, the filtered, recycled air of the airport filling her lungs. She wasn't just boarding a plane, she was boarding a new version of herself. The jet bridge was a narrow, humming tunnel, a limb of the plane that reached out to suck Claire into the sky. As she stepped across the threshold where the carpet met the metal of the aircraft, she felt a sudden drop in air pressure, as if the world were giving her one final, silent warning. "Welcome aboard, miss," a flight attendant said, her smile so perfect it looked painted on. "Seat 1A right this way." Claire was led to the first-class cabin. It was a world of brushed aluminum, cream-colored leather, and the soft, expensive hum of high-end machinery. Her seat wasn't just a chair, it was a suite, a private pod with its own walls and a screen that flickered to life the moment she sat down. For the daughter of a book restorer, this level of modern luxury felt aggressive. It was designed for people who own the world, not for a girl who had spent 2 years hiding from it. She sank into the leather, feeling the seat contour to her body. It was comfortable, yet it felt like a velvet trap. A stewardess appeared almost instantly, holding a silver tray with a flute of sparkling water and a glass of champagne. "A drink to start your journey." Claire reached for the water, her fingers grazing the cold crystal. She watched a man across the aisle, a middle-aged executive in a suit that probably cost more than her father's car. He was barking orders into a phone, confident, loud, and entirely comfortable in his skin. She felt a sharp pang of the imposter syndrome she had read about. "I don't belong here," she thought. "I belong in the back of the bus, in the shadows of the library, in the silence of my indigo room." She opened her leather journal, the smell of the paper a grounding force in the sanitized air of the cabin. She began to sketch the man across the aisle, but instead of drawing his face, she drew a suit of armor with a hollow interior. That was how she saw the world now. Everyone was wearing a costume, pretending they weren't terrified of the heights they were reaching. The engines roared to life, a deep, guttural vibration that shook Claire to her marrow. As the plane taxied down the runway, the speed pushed her back into her seat. It was a physical manifestation of her life moving forward, whether she was ready or not. Then the lift. The moment the wheels left the tarmac, Claire felt a strange, lightheaded sensation. Gravity was losing its grip. She looked out the window as the houses of Oak Ridge became tiny, insignificant squares of gray and green. The school, the library, the street where Sarah lived, they all shrank until they were nothing more than dust on a map. For the first time in 18 years, she was physically higher than her bullies. She was looking down on the town that had tried to bury her. It was a moment of cold, silent triumph. 6 miles above the earth, the cabin became a vacuum of privilege. Claire pulled out her laptop and put on her noise-canceling headphones. This was her element, the space between here and there. She opened a new file and titled it, "The View from Above Project, Los Angeles." She began to write a scene about a girl on a plane who realizes that from 30,000 feet, you can't see people's sneers or hear their whispers. You only see the patterns they make, the lights of the cities, the veins of the rivers. "The higher you go," she typed, her fingers flying across the keys, "the more human they look, not because they are kind, but because they are small. Up here, the Queen of Mirrors is just a speck of glitter in a vast, dark room. Up here, I am finally larger than my fear." As the flight progressed, the sun began to set over the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of electric purple and bruised pink, the colors of a sunset she had only ever seen in movies. "We will be beginning our descent into Los Angeles shortly," the captain announced. Claire looked down. The darkness was being replaced by a sprawling neon grid. It wasn't like Oak Ridge, it looked like a circuit board made of diamonds. It was a city that never slept, a city that lived on stories, a city that was currently waiting for her voice. She closed her laptop. Her hands were no longer shaking. They were cold but steady. The girl who had left the house on Elm Street was gone. The passenger landing in Lax was someone else, a creator, a judge, a ghost who was about to take on a physical form. The landing was not a gentle glide, it was a violent reunion with the earth. The tires of the Boeing 747 shrieked as they hit the runway at Lax, a sound like 1,000 ghosts screaming at once. Claire felt the jolt in her spine, a reminder that the sanctuary of the sky was over. She was back in the world of gravity, oxygen, and people. As the cabin door opened, a wall of air hit Claire. It wasn't the crisp, biting cold of the Midwest, it was a heavy, scented heat. It smelled of sea salt, hot asphalt, expensive rubber, and a faint, underlying hint of something rotting, the true scent of a metropolis. Walking through the jet bridge felt like walking into a furnace. The humidity clung to her indigo sweater, making it feel twice as heavy. Every step away from the plane felt like a step further away from the girl she used to be. The walk through the terminal was a sensory overload. Everything in Los Angeles seemed to be designed to be extra. The advertisements were larger, the colors were more saturated, and the people looked like they had been polished. Even the janitors moved with a certain cinematic rhythm. Claire's heart began its familiar, frantic drumbeat as she reached the arrivals hall. This was the moment of maximum exposure. Hundreds of people stood behind the silver barriers, holding signs, flowers, and expectations. She scanned the crowd, her eyes darting like a trapped bird's, and then she saw him. She scanned the crowd, her eyes darting like a trapped bird's, and then she saw him. A man in a sharp, slate-gray suit stood near the exit. He was holding a digital tablet that glowed with a single line of text, the script of silence. He didn't use her name, he used her title. Claire approached him, her legs feeling as heavy as lead. Up close, the man looked like he was carved out of stone. He had salt and pepper hair and sunglasses tucked into his pocket, despite being indoors. He was the personification of professional Hollywood. I am the one you're looking for," Claire said, her voice sounding thin against the roar of the terminal. The man didn't look disappointed that she wasn't a glamorous star. He didn't look surprised that she was wearing an oversized hoodie and looked like she wanted to disappear. He simply nodded and extended a hand. "I'm Frank," he said, his voice a deep, comforting baritone. "I'm your lead security and transport for the duration of your stay with Apex. Mr. Vane sent me. He said to tell you that the shadows are safe with us." Frank led her outside to the curb where a long, obsidian-black SUV sat idling. It looked less like a car and more like a submarine designed for the streets. The windows were so dark they looked like polished onyx. As Frank opened the heavy door, Claire felt a wave of cool, filtered air escape from the interior. She climbed in, and as the door shut with a solid, muffled thump, the noise of the airport vanished instantly. It was a mobile fortress. As the SUV pulled away from Lax and merged into the shimmering veins of the 405 freeway, Claire pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Los Angeles was a sprawling, chaotic masterpiece. She saw palm trees that looked like frayed matches against the smog-tinted sunset. She saw billboards featuring faces of actors she had only seen on screens, faces that looked perfect, untouchable, and hollow. "Is it always this loud?" Claire asked, looking at the thousands of cars jammed together in a river of red brake lights. "This isn't loud, miss," Frank said, catching her eye in the rearview mirror. "This is just the hum of people trying to be someone else. You'll get used to it, or you won't. Usually the ones who don't get used to it are the ones who make the best stories." They pulled up to a hotel that looked like a Gothic castle dropped into the middle of a tropical garden, the Chateau Marmont. It was a place of legends, scandals, and secrets. "This is where you'll be staying," Frank said. "Apex has the penthouse reserved. Mr. Vane thought you appreciate the privacy. There's a private elevator. You won't have to see a soul if you don't want to." They pulled up to a hotel that looked like a Gothic castle dropped into the middle of a tropical garden, the Chateau Marmont. It was a place of legends, scandals, and secrets. Claire looked up at the stone balconies draped in thick ivy. It was beautiful, but it felt like another cage, a more expensive cage perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. She gripped her leather journal, the only thing in this city that didn't feel like a lie. Tomorrow morning at 10, Frank said, handing her a key card that felt heavy, like real gold. That's when you meet the team, and that's when you meet him. Claire swallowed hard. The him didn't need a name. She knew who he was. The man whose face was on every third billboard she had passed. The man who was supposed to breathe life into her words. She stepped out of the car, the warm California night air wrapping around her like a shroud. She was here. The ghost had arrived in the city of lights. The penthouse of the Chateau Marmont was a symphony of old-world elegance and modern silence. As Claire stepped through the door, the click of the lock felt final. She was alone in a space that was larger than her entire house back in Oak Ridge. The floors were dark, polished oak covered with thick Persian rugs that swallowed the sound of her footsteps. Huge French doors led out to a balcony, but Claire kept them locked. She wasn't ready for the city to come inside yet. She walked through the suite, her eyes wide. There was a grand piano in the corner, its black surface reflecting the dim amber lights like a pool of ink. The bed was a mountain of white silk and down feathers, looking far too pristine to be slept in. But it was the bathroom that stopped her, a sanctuary of white marble with a tub that looked like it had been carved from a single cloud. Everything was perfect, everything was expensive, and everything felt like a threat. A small silver cart sat in the dining area, left there by a silent room service attendant before her arrival. There was a bowl of fresh figs, a plate of artisan cheeses, and a bottle of mineral water in a glass bottle that looked like a piece of art. Claire picked up a fig, its skin cool and waxy. She took a bite, but she couldn't taste it. Her throat was too tight. She felt like a thief who had accidentally broken into a palace and was now being treated like the queen. "They think I'm someone else," she whispered to the empty room. "They think I'm a genius. If they saw me at St. Jude's, hidden in the bathroom stall, would they still give me this room, or would they throw me back into the street?" She sat on the floor, the rugs were softer than any chair she had ever owned, and opened her phone. She needed to feel the silence. She needed to know that the world she built was still there. The comments were pouring in on her latest video. "Your voice saved me tonight," one wrote. "I feel like you're the only person who sees me," another said. She felt a strange, heavy responsibility. She wasn't just here for herself. She was here as the ambassador for every kid who had been told they were nothing. She was the ghost who had finally found a microphone, and now the industry wanted to turn that microphone into a movie. To calm the shivering in her hands, Claire did the only thing she knew how to do. She pulled out her leather journal. She didn't write about the hotel or the figs. She began to write about the man she was going to meet tomorrow, Julian Thorn. She knew his face, of course, everyone did. He was the golden boy of Hollywood, known for his piercing blue eyes and a smile that seemed to promise safety. But Claire, with her cynical observer's mind, saw something else in his photos. She saw a flicker of exhaustion. She saw a man who was tired of being a statue for people to worship. "Julian Thorn," she wrote, her pen scratching against the thick paper. "The man who has everything, playing a character who has nothing. He wants my words to make him feel real. But does he know that reality is a jagged thing? Is he ready to bleed for the script, or does he just want the applause?" She couldn't bring herself to sleep in the massive bed. It felt too exposed. Instead, she took a blanket and a pillow and made a nest for herself on the floor in the corner of the room, near the balcony doors. She lay there, watching the lights of Lowe's angels flicker through the glass. The city looked like a fallen galaxy, beautiful and cold. Somewhere out there, in one of those sparkling mansions, Julian Thorn was probably sleeping, unaware that a girl from Oak Ridge was currently dissecting his soul in her notebook. She closed her eyes, the hum of the city a distant, rhythmic throb. Tomorrow, the paper fortress would be gone forever. Tomorrow, the ghost would have to speak. The morning in Lowe's Angels didn't break with the soft, chirping birds of Oak Ridge. It broke with the aggressive glare of a sun that felt like a spotlight. At 6:00 a.m., the light pierced through the ivy of the Chateau Marmont, hitting Claire's face where she lay on the floor. She woke up with her heart already racing, the transition from sleep to reality feeling like a sudden drop in an elevator. Claire stood before the massive, walk-in closet of the penthouse. It was lined with cedar wood, smelling of old wealth. She had brought a small suitcase, and now, looking at her clothes, they felt like rags from a different century. She pulled out her armor, a charcoal gray oversized sweater made of heavy wool, and a pair of simple black trousers. She didn't want to look like a Hollywood writer. She didn't want to wear the silk dresses or the sharp blazers her mother had suggested. She wanted to be invisible, even when she was standing in the center of the room. As she dressed, she watched herself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She looked pale, her eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. She tied her hair back in a tight, low bun, no loose strands, no distractions. She was a woman going to war, but her weapons were ink and silence. She spent 30 minutes in the marble bathroom staring at her reflection. She applied a tiny bit of tinted lip balm, then immediately wiped it off. "No," she whispered to the mirror, "don't try to be pretty, be the voice, be the mind." She practiced her neutral face, the face she used to survive the hallways of St. Jude, a face that revealed nothing, a face that was a blank slate. She needed to be a fortress that no one could climb. Before leaving, she opened her leather journal one last time. She checked the scripts she had printed out. They were her only shield. She ran her fingers over the embossed letters on the cover. The leather was warm, holding the heat of her hands. She took a deep breath, the scent of the white marble and the expensive hotel soap filling her lungs. It felt sterile. She missed the smell of her father's workshop, the glue, the old paper, the dust. Here, everything was too clean, too perfect, and it made her feel like a smudge of dirt on a white canvas. At 9:45 a.m., her phone buzzed. A text from Frank: "I'm at the side entrance. The black SUV is ready when you are." Claire grabbed her satchel, slinging it across her chest like a bandolier. She didn't take the main elevator. She used the service stairs, preferring the cold, concrete echoes to the mirrored walls of the guest lift. Each step down felt like she was descending into an arena. When she stepped out of the hotel, the heat of the sidewalk rose up to meet her. The air was thick with the sound of distant sirens and the constant hum of the city. Frank was standing by the door of the SUV, his face unreadable behind his sunglasses. He opened the door for her without a word, recognizing that today was not a day for small talk. As they drove through West Hollywood, Claire watched the world outside. People were sitting at sidewalk cafes, drinking green juices and laughing. They looked so effortless. Claire felt a surge of resentment, a familiar, bitter taste in the back of her throat. They don't know how hard it is to just breathe, she thought. The SUV eventually pulled up to a towering building made entirely of black glass. It looked like an obsidian tooth rising out of the pavement. At the top, in discreet silver letters, it said, "Apex Studios." "This is it, miss," Frank said, his voice unusually soft. "Take your time. They're lucky to have you in that building, not the other way around." Claire looked at him, surprised by the kindness in his voice. She gave a small, barely visible nod. She stepped out of the car, the glass of the building reflecting her small, gray figure. She looked like a speck of dust against a mountain. She walked toward the revolving glass doors. She could feel the eyes of the security guards on her. She could feel the vibration of the city under her feet. But as she pushed through the door and the cool, pressurized air of the lobby hit her, Claire felt a sudden, icy calm. The paper fortress was gone. The chrysalis was over. The ghost was stepping into the light, and God help anyone who tried to stop her. The lobby of Apex Studios was a cathedral of ego. The ceilings were 40 feet high, and the walls were adorned with massive, backlit posters of films that had defined generations. Claire felt like an ant crawling across a master's painting. She checked in at the mahogany desk, her voice barely a whisper, and was handed a guest badge that felt like a brand on her chest. The elevator was a high-speed glass capsule. As it shot up to the 42nd floor, Claire's stomach stayed on the ground. She watched the city of Lowe's angels drop away beneath her, becoming a miniature model of a civilization she didn't understand. When the doors chimed open, the air was different. It smelled of expensive ozone, expensive paper, and expensive power. She was led to Conference Room A, also known as the Obsidian Chamber. The room was dominated by a table made of a single slab of black volcanic rock, polished to a mirror finish. There were 6 people already there. Marcus Vane was easy to spot. He was the one packing, a phone in one hand and a kale smoothie in the other. The others were the suits, lawyers, producers, and creative executives, all wearing smiles that didn't reach their eyes. "She's here," Marcus shouted, his voice echoing off the glass. The voice herself, Claire, "Welcome to the birthplace of your future." Claire didn't smile, she didn't shake hands. She sat at the far end of the volcanic table, placing her leather journal in front of her like a shield. She felt their eyes scanning her, her oversized sweater, her lack of makeup, her defensive posture. She could almost hear them thinking, "This is the genius, this shy girl." "We're just waiting for Julian," Marcus said, checking his Rolex. "He's coming straight from a wardrobe fitting for his next." The heavy oak doors at the end of the room swung open before Marcus could finish. The energy in the room shifted instantly, the air becoming electric and thick. Julian Thorn walked in. He didn't walk, he moved with the effortless grace of someone who had never been told no. He was wearing a simple white t-shirt that looked like it cost $500 and dark denim jeans. His hair was artfully disheveled and his skin had that golden California glow. But it was his eyes that caught Claire off guard. They weren't just blue, they were the color of a shallow sea before a storm. The room erupted into Hollywood noise. Everyone stood up, everyone wanted a piece of him. Julian, buddy, great to see you, man. Did you see the latest numbers? Julian ignored them all. His gaze traveled down the long, black table, past the lawyers and the producers, until it landed on the girl in the charcoal sweater at the very end. Claire felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated fear. She wanted to look away, to hide behind her bun, to disappear into the floor. But for the first time in her life, she didn't. She stared back. She used her observer's eyes, the ones that saw through the masks. In that split second, she didn't see a movie star. She saw a man who was performing even when he was just walking into a room. She saw the tension in his jaw and the way his eyes didn't match his casual smile. Julian, Marcus said, gesturing toward Claire. This is Claire, the mind behind the script of silence. Claire, this is Julian Thorn, your protagonist. Julian walked toward her. The silence in the room became heavy, the suits watching the interaction like they were witnessing a chemical experiment. He stopped 2 feet away from her. The scent of sandalwood and expensive citrus drifted toward her. He didn't offer a handshake. He looked down at the leather journal on the table. I stayed up until 4 in the morning reading your treatment for the first episode, Julian said. His voice was deeper than it was on screen, a rich, textured baritone that vibrated in Claire's chest. You wrote that the character feels like he's made of glass in a world made of hammers. That's a very specific kind of pain, Claire. Claire's throat felt dry. It's the only kind of pain that matters, she replied, her voice steadying. The pain of being seen but not understood. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A look of genuine surprise flickered in his eyes, replaced immediately by a deep, searching curiosity. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the volcanic table, looking directly into her eyes. I think, Julian whispered, loud enough for only her to hear, that you and I are going to have a very difficult, very beautiful time together. The atmosphere in the obsidian chamber shifted from a corporate meeting to a theatrical interrogation. Julian took the seat directly across from Claire, his presence occupying more space than the 6 executives combined. The suits opened their slim laptops, their fingers poised like vultures over keys, ready to dissect Claire's soul for marketability. It's a brilliant start, Claire, Marcus began, leaning back and forming a steeple with his fingers. The ghost protagonist is haunting, but the marketing team is worried. It's too quiet. We need more noise. Maybe a bigger confrontation in the first act, a car chase, something to grab the Gen Z demographic in the first 30 seconds. Claire felt the old familiar heat of resentment rising. This was exactly what her teachers had tried to do, edit her into something loud and hollow. She looked at Marcus, her eyes turning into flint. If you want noise, Claire said, her voice dropping to that low, resonant pitch that had made her a star on YouTube, you've hired the wrong person. Silence isn't the absence of sound, it's the presence of tension. A car chase is a distraction. A girl sitting alone in a crowded cafeteria, realizing no one knows her name, that is a tragedy. That is what people will remember. The room went dead silent. One of the lawyers actually stopped typing. No one talked to Marcus Vane like that, especially not a 21-year-old girl in a thrift store sweater. Julian didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his chin resting on his hand, watching Claire with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He wasn't looking at her as a writer anymore. He was looking at her as a puzzle he couldn't solve. The character I'm playing, Julian interrupted, his voice cutting through the corporate tension. He's a man who has lived his whole life as a statue. He's tired of being the golden boy. He wants to crack. Claire, why did you write that he hates his own reflection? Claire turned her gaze to Julian. This was the moment of truth. She forgot about the lawyers and the kale smoothies. She was back in her indigo room, talking to the ghost. He hates his reflection, Claire said, leaning forward until her chest almost touched the black volcanic table, because the reflection is the only thing people love. He's a man who's being eaten alive by his own image. Every time he smiles for a camera, a piece of his real self dies. He doesn't want to be a hero, Julian. He wants to be a person. And being a person means being allowed to be ugly, to be weak, to be silent. She paused, her eyes locked onto Julian's. The question is, are you brave enough to be ugly on camera, or are you too attached to being perfect? A collective gasp seemed to ripple through the suits. To challenge Julian Thorn, the man whose face sold $1 billion in movie tickets, on his vanity was professional suicide. But Julian didn't get angry. Instead, he started to laugh, a soft, dry laugh that sounded like it had been trapped in his throat for years. He looked at Marcus, then back at Claire. She's terrifying, Julian whispered, a genuine, unscripted smile breaking across his face. Marcus, stop talking about car chases. Let her write. Give her whatever she wants. If she wants 10 minutes of silence, we give her 10 minutes of silence. Because for the first time in 10 years, I've met someone who isn't afraid to tell me I'm a hollow shell. The power dynamic in the room flipped in an instant. The executives began to scribble notes furiously. The lawyers started nodding. If Julian Thorn was on board, the project was gold. Claire felt a strange, dizzying sensation. For 18 years, people had ignored her. Now the most famous man in the world was handing her the keys to his career. She looked down at her leather journal. The ink was still there. The words were still hers. "I have one more condition," Claire said, her voice regaining its icy calm. "Anything," Marcus said, his eyes gleaming with the scent of a potential Emmy Award. "I don't want a writer's room," Claire stated, her gaze sweeping the room. "I write alone. I don't want people polishing my thoughts. If you want the script of silence, you get the silence too. I deal only with the director and Julian." Julian stood up, extending his hand across the table. It was a formal gesture, but his eyes were burning with a new kind of fire. "Deal," Julian said. Claire looked at his hand, large, tanned, and powerful. She hesitated for a second, then reached out and took it. His skin was warm and his grip was firm. As their hands met, Claire felt a jolt of energy, a collision of two very different worlds. The paper fortress hadn't just been dismantled, it had been expanded. She was no longer hiding from the world, she was starting to rewrite it. The heavy oak doors of the obsidian chamber closed behind the suits, leaving a ringing silence in the hallway. Claire felt as if she had just finished a marathon. Her hands were cold, her adrenaline was crashing, and all she wanted was to find a dark corner and breathe. But the universe had other plans. She walked toward the elevator, her satchel heavy against her hip. She heard a rhythmic, confident stride behind her, the sound of expensive leather boots on polished marble. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The air around her seemed to vibrate with his presence. "Claire, wait up," Julian's voice echoed, catching her just as she reached the glass lift. She stopped, her back to him for a second, closing her eyes to steady her breath. When she turned, he was standing there, leaning against the glass wall with a casualness that felt like an insult to her nervous system. He had discarded the golden boy smile. His face looked sharper now, more real. "You're not going back to the hotel yet, are you?" Julian asked. It wasn't a demand, but a genuine question. "The air in this building is 70% ego and 30% recycled oxygen. It'll make you crazy if you don't get out." "I was planning on disappearing," Claire said, clutching the strap of her bag. "Disappearing is my specialty," Julian replied with a wry half-smile. "But before you go, walk with me. There's a terrace on the 40th floor. No cameras, no agents, just the smog and the view. I want to know where you learned to read people like they're open books." They stood on the outdoor terrace, the wind whipping Claire's stray hairs from her bun. Below them, Lowe's angels stretched out like a glittering, chaotic carpet. From this height, the sirens were just a hum, and the people were invisible. "You called me a hollow shell back there," Julian said, looking out at the horizon. He wasn't looking at her, which made it easier for her to stay. "In front of the people who pay my bills, that took a lot of, let's call it, creative courage." "It wasn't courage," Claire replied, her voice gaining strength. "It was an observation. You look like you've been wearing a mask so long that you've forgotten what your own skin feels like. I didn't write that script for a movie star. I wrote it for someone who is drowning in plain sight." Julian turned to look at her. The sunlight hit his face, revealing the fine lines of fatigue around his eyes, the kind of detail the cameras always blurred out. For the first time, he looked vulnerable. "How did you know?" he whispered. "I've spent 10 years making sure no one saw that. My publicist, my manager, even my mother. They only see the product. How did a girl from a town I've never heard of see through the glare?" "Because I spent my whole life being the person no one looked at," Claire said, her voice soft but firm. "When you're invisible, you learn to see everything. I spent years watching people's eyes when they thought no one was watching. I know what performance looks like, Julian, and you're performing right now." Julian let out a long, shaky breath. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. The distance between them, the wall of fame and the wall of trauma, seemed to thin for a moment. "I want this movie to be the thing that breaks the mask," Julian said. "I don't care about the awards or the box office. I want to feel something real again. But I need you to be ruthless with me, Claire. Don't let me get away with being perfect on screen." "I don't know how to be anything other than ruthless," Claire replied. "I'm starting to realize that," he said, and this time his smile reached his eyes. It was a small, tired smile, but it was honest. He walked her back to the elevator. As the doors began to close, he put his hand out to stop them for a second. "Get some sleep, Claire. We start the dissection of the first script tomorrow morning at my place. Frank will pick you up, and don't wear a different sweater. I like the charcoal. It makes you look like a storm." The doors shut. Claire was alone in the glass capsule, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at her reflection. Her face was flushed and her eyes were bright. She wasn't just a ghost anymore. She was a storm, and the most famous man in the world was waiting for the rain. The return to the Chateau Marmont felt different this time. The silence of the penthouse was no longer a threat, it was a sanctuary. Claire walked through the door and didn't even turn on the lights. She let the neon glow of the sunset strip filter through the ivy, casting long, jagged shadows across the oak floor. She didn't make a nest on the floor tonight. Instead, she sat on the edge of the massive silk bed, her boots still on. She felt a strange, intoxicating sense of power. For years, she had been the one being dissected by teachers, by bullies, by the cold eyes of her peers. But today, in that obsidian room, she had been the one with the scalpel. She opened her laptop. The screen's white light illuminated her face, making her look like a ghost again, but a ghost with a purpose. She opened the file for the first episode, titled The Glass Mirror. She began to delete. She deleted the safe dialogue. She deleted the scenes that felt like every other Hollywood drama. She thought about Julian's eyes on the terrace, the way they looked when he admitted he was tired. Scene 14, the vanity interior. Julian's character's bedroom. Night. The character doesn't speak. He doesn't cry. He simply stands before a mirror and begins to trace the lines of his own face with a piece of charcoal, trying to find the man beneath the symmetry. He draws until his face is a smudge of black, until he is unrecognizable. Only then does he breathe. She was writing for him now, not the Julian Thorn on the billboards, but the Julian who smelled like sandalwood and exhaustion. She was giving him the ugliness he asked for. As she wrote, the room around her seemed to vanish. She wasn't in a luxury hotel in LA, she was back in the flow. But there was a new element in her imagination now, a voice. Every line she wrote, she heard in Julian's deep, textured baritone. She could see the way his jaw would tighten at a certain word. She stopped typing and looked at her hand. It was steady. For the first time in years, the tremble was gone. I am rewriting him, she whispered to the darkness, and in doing so, am I rewriting myself. Around 3:00 a.m., her phone chimed. It was a notification from her YouTube channel, a new comment on an old video. Whoever you are, thank you for being the only voice that doesn't lie. Claire stared at the comment. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. Here she was, eating figs in a penthouse and talking to movie stars, while her silence, the thousands of lonely kids who followed her, were still trapped in their own rooms, still suffering in the dark. She realized she couldn't just succeed. She had to take them with her. This movie couldn't be a lie, it had to be a bridge. She closed her laptop and finally took off her boots. She didn't sleep much, but when she did, she didn't dream of the school hallways or Mrs. Gable. She dreamed of a storm that started in a small room in Oak Ridge and was now gathering strength over the Pacific Ocean. She woke up before the alarm. She didn't hesitate. She showered in the marble tub, the hot water washing away the last lingering traces of victim Claire. She put on a fresh black turtleneck, her new uniform. She packed her journal, her laptop, and the new, raw pages she had written overnight. She was going to Julian's house. She was going into the heart of the golden boy's life, and she was bringing the darkness with her. When Frank pulled up in the black SUV at 9:00 a.m., he noticed the change immediately. He didn't say anything, but he held the door open with a new kind of respect. "To the hills, miss?" Frank asked. "To the hills, Frank," Claire replied, her voice as sharp as a diamond. "Let's see if Mr. Thorn is ready to get his hands dirty." The drive to the Hollywood Hills was a winding ascent through a paradise that felt artificial. The SUV climbed the narrow, serpent-like roads where the air grew thinner and the houses grew more defiant, clinging to the cliffs like expensive parasites. Claire watched as the sprawling chaos of the city transformed into a silent, manicured wilderness. They stopped before a massive gate of rusted steel, artfully rusted, of course, that opened with a silent, hydraulic hiss. Frank drove up a long driveway lined with silver birch trees that seemed to lean away from the wind. At the end of the path sat Julian Thorn's home. It wasn't a house, it was a masterpiece of mid-century modern architecture, a structure of floor-to-ceiling glass and cold concrete perched on the edge of a canyon. It looked like a place where someone lived to be seen, yet remained entirely hidden. "I'll be waiting at the bottom of the hill, miss," Frank said as he opened the door. "If you need anything at all, you have my number." Claire nodded, her heart starting its familiar, jagged rhythm. She stood before the massive pivot door, her black turtleneck feeling like a second skin. She felt small, a dark smudge against the pristine white of the mountain. The door opened before she could even reach for the bell. It was Julian, but not the Julian from the obsidian chamber. He was barefoot, wearing a pair of faded linen trousers and a charcoal gray t-shirt that had a small hole near the collar. His hair wasn't artfully disheveled anymore. It was just messy, as if he'd been running his hands through it for hours. In his hand, he held a ceramic mug with a chip in the rim. "You're early," he said, but his voice lacked the defensive edge of the day before. It sounded gravelly, raw. "I like people who are early. It means they're hungry." He led her inside. The interior was vast and minimalist. There were no family photos, no trophies, no golden boy memorabilia. It was a gallery of expensive silence. The only sound was the distant hum of the pool's filtration system and the wind whistling through the canyon. "Sit anywhere," Julian said, gesturing to a massive sunken living area that looked out over the entire San Fernando Valley. "I was just reading the pages you sent at 4:00 a.m. I assume you don't sleep." "Sleep is for people who aren't haunted," Claire replied, her voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. Julian stopped mid-stride. He turned to look at her, a strange, knowing smile playing on his lips. "Well then, we're going to be a very sleep-deprived duo." He sat on the floor, ignoring the multi-thousand-dollar sofa, and spread Claire's new pages out on the low marble table. He had highlighted sections in red ink. Claire sat across from him, her legs tucked under her, her leather journal open like a shield. "Scene 14, Julian said, his finger hovering over the charcoal scene she had written in the middle of the night. The mirror, the charcoal on the face. Why, Claire? Why would a man who is paid for his face want to erase it?" "Because he wants to see if there's a soul underneath the symmetry," Claire said, her eyes locked on his. "You told me you wanted to be ugly. Ugliness isn't just a lack of beauty, Julian. It's the truth that's left when the lights go out. If you're afraid of the charcoal, you can't play this part." Julian leaned forward, the smell of sandalwood and bitter coffee drifting toward her. The space between them felt charged, like the air before a lightning strike. "I'm not afraid of the charcoal," he whispered, his eyes searching hers with a desperate, almost painful intensity. "I'm afraid that once I put it on, I won't want to take it off. I'm afraid that the hollow shell is all that's left." Claire felt a lump in her throat. For a second, she wasn't the genius writer, and he wasn't the movie star. They were just two people standing on the edge of a cliff, looking for a way down. "Then we'll find out together," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "But we do it my way, no ego, no masks, just the words." Julian looked at her for a long time, then he picked up a pen and handed it to her. "Rewrite the next scene, right here, right now, show me what else I'm hiding." The sun began its slow crawl across the canyon, casting long, skeletal shadows of the birch trees into Julian's living room. The marble floor was now covered in Claire's papers, white sheets scattered like fallen snow in a house that had never known a winter. "Again," Claire said, her voice cold and precise. "You're still doing it, Julian. You're still acting like you're sad. I don't want to see a movie star crying. I want to see a man who has run out of tears and only has silence left." Julian stood in the center of the vast room, looking exhausted. He had been repeating the same monologue for 3 hours. He wiped a hand across his forehead, leaving a smudge of the actual charcoal Claire had made him use. "It's hard, Claire," he snapped, his frustration finally breaking the golden boy veneer. "I've spent 15 years being told to sell the emotion. You're asking me to bury it." "Because that's what real people do." Claire stood up, her small frame looking defiant against the glass backdrop of the hills. "In Oak Ridge, when they laughed at me in the hallway, I didn't act sad for the cameras. I went home and I became a stone. I want that stone, Julian. Give me the stone." Julian stared at her. The silence between them became heavy, pressurized. Then something shifted. He dropped his shoulders. He let the light in his eyes go out. He sat back down on the cold floor, his back against the glass wall. He didn't look at the script. He started to speak the lines, but his voice was different. It was a hollow, dry rasp, the sound of someone who had spent too long in a desert. "I look in the mirror," Julian whispered, his gaze fixed on a spot of dust on the floor, "and I see a ghost that everyone wants to touch. They love the ghost, but they are stepping on the man underneath. And the man is just tired of holding up the haunting." Claire felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. This was it. The script of silence was no longer just words on a page. It was a living, breathing entity. She walked over to him, something she never would have done 48 hours ago, and sat on the floor a few feet away. She didn't offer a hug, she didn't offer comfort. She offered the only thing she knew was real, recognition. "That's it," she said softly. "That's the man I wrote for." Julian looked up at her. For a moment, the celebrity vanished. He looked like a boy who had finally been found in a game of hide-and-seek that had lasted way too long. "Why does it feel like you're the only person who has ever actually looked at me?" Julian asked. It wasn't a flirtatious line. It was a terrifyingly honest question. Maybe because I'm the only one who isn't afraid of what I'll find when the lights go out, Claire replied. They stayed like that for a long time, sitting on the floor of a multi-million-dollar mansion that felt as lonely as a lighthouse. Julian reached for a second mug of coffee, now cold, and shared a plate of simple crackers with her. As they worked through the afternoon, the roles began to blur. Claire found herself acting out the other characters, her voice shifting and morphing, bringing the world of her paper fortress into the hills. Julian listened to her as if she were an oracle. He wasn't the lead actor, and she wasn't the hire. They were two architects building a cathedral of shadows. "Tell me about Oak Ridge," Julian said suddenly during a break. "Tell me about the girl who wrote these words. I want to know the source of the rain." Claire stiffened, her fingers gripped her leather journal. "Oak Ridge is just a place. It's not important." "It's the most important thing in this room," Julian insisted, leaning in. "You've stripped me bare today, Claire. You've seen my cracks. It's only fair I see one of yours." Claire looked out at the canyon. The sun was setting, turning the sky into a bruised purple, the same color as her room back home. "They called me the Shadow," she said, her voice barely audible. "Not because I was dark, but because they thought I didn't exist without someone else's light. I wrote to prove that the shadow had a heart of its own. I wrote to survive the people who thought my silence was an invitation to hurt me." Julian didn't say "I'm sorry." He didn't offer a platitude. He just nodded slowly. "Well," Julian said, his eyes burning with a fierce, protective light, "the shadow is about to eclipse the sun, and I'm going to make sure they all have to look at it." The clock on the wall of Julian's kitchen, a minimalist piece of art that didn't even have numbers, marked 8:00 p.m. The script pages were now stained with coffee rings and charcoal dust, looking like a battlefield map. "Enough for today," Julian said, standing up and stretching. His joints popped, a sound of pure physical exhaustion. "If we do one more page, I think my brain will actually melt onto the marble." "I should call Frank," Claire said, reaching for her phone. "No," Julian said, his eyes flashing with a sudden, rebellious spark. "Frank is a great guy, but he's part of the Apex machine. Let me take you back. I have a car in the garage that even the paparazzi haven't seen yet. We can take the long way, Mulholland Drive. You haven't seen the city until you've seen it from the ridge." They descended into a garage that looked like a laboratory. In the center sat a vintage 1960s Porsche, silver and sleek, looking like a bullet made of moonlight. "Put this on," Julian said, handing her a baseball cap and a pair of oversized sunglasses. "In this town, the best way to be invisible is to look like everyone else trying to be invisible." As the Porsche roared to life, the sound echoing off the concrete walls, Claire felt a rush of adrenaline. This wasn't the shielded, heavy SUV. This was raw, fast, and exposed. They shot out of the garage and onto the winding roads of the hills, the wind whipping through the open windows. Mulholland Drive was a ribbon of black asphalt suspended over a sea of lights. Julian drove with a focused intensity, his hands steady on the steering wheel. For a few minutes there were no scripts, no suits, and no silence. There was just the hum of the engine and the blur of the city below. "You see those lights, Claire?" Julian shouted over the wind, gesturing to the glowing grid of LA. "Every one of those lights is a person hopping for a story, and most of them are being fed lies. That's why your voice matters. You're giving them the truth they're starving for." The moment of peace didn't last. As they descended toward West Hollywood to get Claire back to the chateau, they stopped at a red light near a popular club. Suddenly a flash went off, then another. A group of paparazzi, men with cameras that looked like weapons, had spotted the car. They didn't care about the vintage Porsche. They recognized the jawline of the man driving it. "Julian, Julian, who's the girl? Is she the new lad, Julian? Look over here, Julian, give us a smile." The lenses were inches from the glass. The flashes were like lightning strikes, blinding and aggressive. Claire felt a wave of nausea. This was the noise she had spent her life running from. It wasn't the school hallway, but it felt the same, the feeling of being hunted, of being a thing to be captured. Julian didn't smile. He didn't look at them. He reached over with his right hand and pushed Claire's head down gently, shielding her from the glare with his own body. "Don't look at the light, Claire," he growled, his voice low and protective. "Stay in the shadow. I've got you." The light turned green and he slammed his foot on the accelerator. The Porsche roared, leaving the shouting men and the blinding flashes in a cloud of exhaust. He didn't slow down until they were blocks away, hidden in the darker side streets. When they finally pulled into the side entrance of the Chateau Marmont, the silence of the car was deafening. Claire's heart was hammering against her ribs so hard it hurt. She was trembling, not from fear of the men, but from the sheer violence of the attention. "I'm sorry," Julian said, his voice thick with regret. He was still holding the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. "I thought we could have 1 hour without the circus. I shouldn't have risked it." Claire sat up, adjusting her cap. She looked at him, seeing the anger and the sadness in his eyes. "That's your life," she whispered, "every day, every hour." "That's why I need the script of silence, Claire," Julian replied, looking at her with an intensity that made her catch her breath. "Because when the world is that loud, the only way to survive is to have a world inside you that no one can touch. You have that world. I'm just trying to find my way into it." He didn't get out of the car. It was too dangerous now. Claire opened the door, the cool night air of the hotel gardens greeting her. "Tomorrow," Julian said, "same time, we finish the first act." "Tomorrow," Claire agreed. She walked toward the private elevator, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. She didn't look back. She needed to get to her journal. She needed to write down the feeling of the flash, not as a victim, but as a witness. She was realizing that Julian Thorn wasn't just her actor. He was her most complicated character, and she was the only one who could save him from the light. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt like a journey through a vacuum. Claire stepped into her suite, but she didn't feel like a queen tonight. She felt like a target. The flashes of the paparazzi were still burned into her retinas, dancing like white ghosts every time she closed her eyes. She threw her satchel on the floor and went straight for her phone. She didn't want to look, but she had to. She opened a major celebrity gossip site, and there it was, a grainy, high-speed photo of the silver Porsche. The headline screamed, "Mystery Girl, who is Julian Thorn's new muse?" The photo was blurry, but Claire's profile was unmistakable. The oversized charcoal sweater, the messy bun, the pale skin. In the comments section, the world was already dissecting her. "She looks like a librarian," one wrote. "Is she a fan? She's definitely not his usual type," said another. But then a notification popped up on her private Instagram, an account she hadn't checked in weeks. A message request from Sarah. Claire's heart stopped. The air in the room suddenly felt as cold as the hallways of St. Jude. "Is that you, Claire?" the message read. "Everyone in Oak Ridge is talking. We saw the photo. How did a freak like you end up in a Porsche with Julian Thorn? Did you cast a spell on him with those weird scripts of yours? Don't get too comfortable. I still have the videos from junior year. Maybe the world would like to see the genius crying in the bathroom stalls." Claire felt the floor tilt beneath her. The paper fortress felt like it was made of dry straw, and Sarah was holding a match. All the progress she had made with Julian, all the strength she had gathered in the obsidian chamber, it all felt like a lie. She walked to the French doors and pressed her forehead against the glass. The neon lights of LA looked like predatory eyes. She realized that fame wasn't a shield, it was a magnifying glass. It made your successes larger, but it made your scars look like canyons. "They'll find out," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "They'll see the videos, they'll see the girl who couldn't speak. They'll realize I'm just a broken thing they accidentally invited to the party." She sat at her laptop, her fingers trembling so hard she could barely type. She opened a blank document. Her first instinct was to write an apology to Julian, to Apex, to the world, to tell them she was sorry for being a freak. But then she saw her leather journal lying on the floor. It was open to the page where Julian had spilled a drop of coffee. She remembered his voice. "The shadow is about to eclipse the sun." She didn't write an apology. She began to write a new scene for the script, a scene where the protagonist is confronted by a ghost from his past, and instead of running, he invites the ghost to sit down and watch him win. For the next 4 hours, Claire didn't move. She ignored the buzzing of her phone. Sarah sent 3 more messages, each one more vicious than the last. She ignored the mystery girl headlines that were now trending on Twitter. She poured all the bile, all the fear, and all the Oak Ridge poison into the dialogue. She made the character's pain so raw it felt like an open wound. If the world wanted to see her cry, she would give them tears that tasted like acid. By 5:00 a.m., the room was filled with the gray, sickly light of a California dawn. Claire stood up, her back aching, her eyes bloodshot. She felt a strange, cold clarity. Sarah was still in Oak Ridge, a small person in a small town, clinging to old videos like they were gold. But Claire was in a penthouse at the Chateau Marmont, writing the words that the most famous man in the world was waiting to speak. She blocked Sarah's account. She deleted the Instagram app. She walked to the bathroom, splashed cold water on her face, and looked at herself. She didn't look like a librarian. She didn't look like a freak. She looked like a storm that was just getting started. "Let them watch," she said to her reflection. I'm not a ghost anymore, I'm the one who writes the ending. The morning air was thick with the scent of eucalyptus and expensive smog as Frank pulled the SUV up to the Hollywood Hills. Claire sat in the back, her laptop bag gripped so tightly her knuckles looked like white marble. She hadn't slept, but she didn't feel tired. She felt electric. When Julian opened the door this time, he was already dressed, black jeans, a dark gray shirt, and eyes that looked like they had been scouring the internet all night. He didn't say good morning. He didn't ask how she was. I saw the headlines, Julian said, his voice a low growl of protective anger. And I saw the comments. Claire, I am so incredibly sorry. I never should have taken that car out. It's not the headlines that matter, Julian, Claire said, walking past him into the glass-walled living room. She sounded different, colder, sharper. It's what they woke up. She turned to face him, standing in the center of his pristine house. She opened her laptop and didn't show him a script. She showed him the message from Sarah, the digital venom from Oak Ridge, glowing on the screen. Julian read it in silence. Claire watched his jaw clench, a muscle feathering in his cheek. The golden boy was gone. In his place was a man who looked like he wanted to burn a town to the ground. She thinks she can break me with a video of me crying in a bathroom, Claire whispered. She thinks that girl still exists. Does she? Julian asked, looking up from the screen, his eyes burning with an intensity that made Claire's breath hitch. No, Claire said, slamming the laptop shut. That girl is dead. I killed her last night, and I used her ashes to write the ending of Act 1. She handed him the new pages. They were raw, jagged, and beautiful. She had rewritten his character's confrontation with his past. It wasn't about forgiveness or moving on. It was about transcendence. Julian read the pages, his eyes moving fast. When he finished, he looked at her with a mixture of awe and something that looked dangerously like devotion. You're not just a writer, Claire, he said, stepping closer until he was within her personal space, a space she usually guarded like a fortress. You're a force of nature. You took their poison and turned it into diamonds. The air in the room changed. The work was still there, but something else had entered the vacuum. Julian reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before he tucked a loose strand of hair behind Claire's ear. His touch was warm, a stark contrast to the cold glass of the house. They want to see the mystery girl, Julian whispered, his face inches from hers. Then let's give them something to look at. We start filming the pilot in 3 days, and I want you on set every second, not as a ghost in the shadows, but as the woman who owns every word I say. Claire looked out at the Los Angeles skyline. For the first time, it didn't look like a predator. It looked like a stage. She had survived the flight, the airport, the suits, the paparazzi, and the ghosts of Oak Ridge. She had turned her silence into a symphony. As she looked into Julian's blue eyes, she realized that the script of silence was no longer just about a character. It was about her. And as for the love part, she could feel it simmering beneath the surface, a slow-burning fire that was about to consume them both. But that was a story for the next chapter. I'm ready, Claire said, her voice echoing with a power she never knew she possessed. Let's show them what a shadow can do when it's tired of hiding.